law professors don't get shot in broad daylight.
Who would ever want to shoot Dan Markel?
The police have called this a murder for hire, and these guys didn't hire themselves.
In a quiet Tallahassee neighborhood, a law professor pulled his car into his garage and never made it back inside his house. Dan Markel had been shot twice in the head. At first, investigators had no obvious killer. There was no forced entry, no robbery, no apparent reason for a stranger to choose this particular man. But there was one detail that made the case different from the beginning. The people who wanted Dan Markel gone were not necessarily the people who pulled the trigger. And the trail would eventually lead from a suburban Florida garage to a rented Toyota Prius, from the Prius to two men from South Florida, from those men to an intermediary, and then into the family Markel had been fighting in court for years. 12 years after the murder, 5 people would be charged and convicted for their roles in the plot. But even after those convictions, one question continued to hang over the case. How did a bitter family dispute become a murder-for-hire conspiracy? And how much did the people at the center of that family conflict know before Dan Markel was killed? Dan Markel was a law professor at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. He was 41 years old when he was killed. He had built a career around criminal law, public policy, and legal scholarship. To colleagues, he was an accomplished academic. To his family, he was a father of 2 young boys. His personal life, however, had become increasingly complicated. Markel had married Wendi Adelson in 2006. Wendi was also highly educated and had a close relationship with her family in South Florida. For several years, the marriage appeared to be a normal professional relationship between 2 people building careers. Then, the marriage ended. On September 10, 2012, Wendi filed for divorce. The divorce itself became only the beginning of a much larger dispute. The most important disagreement was not simply about the marriage. It was about where the couple's 2 children would live. Wendi wanted to move with the children to South Florida, where her parents and brother lived. Markel opposed the relocation. The dispute eventually reached court, and in June 2013, a judge denied Wendi's request to relocate with the children. That decision mattered because South Florida was not simply another destination. It was where Wendi's family lived, including her parents Donna and Harvey Adelson and her brother Charles. According to the Florida First District Court of Appeal, the Adelson family wanted Wendi to return to South Florida with the children, while Markel opposed the move. Court records later cited evidence that Donna even suggested Wendi offer Markel $1 million in exchange for allowing the relocation. But Markel did not agree. The divorce was finalized on July 31, 2013. The legal marriage was over. The custody conflict was not. In the months that followed, the relationship between Markel and the Adelson family remained strained. There were disagreements over custody and visitation. There were legal filings. There were disputes over access to the children. And there was something else that would become extremely important after Markel's death. A joke. According to Wendi Adelson, her brother Charlie had joked that he could hire a hitman to kill Dan, but that buying Wendi a television was cheaper. At the time, Wendi said she regarded it as a joke. She later told investigators about it on the very day Dan was shot. That detail is difficult to understand without knowing what happened next. Because in July 2014, the idea of a hitman stopped being a joke. On July 18, 2014, Dan Markel began his morning as usual. Surveillance footage later became critical to investigators because it showed a vehicle following Markel's movements. Markel drove to his son's school. He went to the gym. And then he drove home. The vehicle following him was a Toyota Prius. Investigators would eventually determine that this was not an innocent coincidence, but they did not know that when the first 911 call came in, Markel had arrived home and entered his garage. At some point shortly before 11 a.m., he was shot. A neighbor reported seeing a light-colored vehicle leaving the area. Inside the garage, Markel was critically wounded. There was no obvious burglary. Nothing suggested that a random thief had entered the house and encountered him by chance. The shooting appeared targeted. Markel was taken to a local hospital. He died approximately 15 hours after he was shot, and almost immediately, investigators had to answer a question that would define the case for years. Who would want a law professor and father of two dead badly enough to send someone to kill him? The first people investigators needed to understand were the people closest to Markel. That included his former wife. On the afternoon of July 18th, police located Wendi at a restaurant and brought her in for questioning. The interview lasted more than 5 hours. Wendi told investigators about the divorce, the custody dispute, her desire to leave Tallahassee, and the conflict surrounding Dan. She also mentioned her brother Charlie. And she told police about the hitman joke. That was an extraordinary detail for someone to volunteer during the first hours of a homicide investigation. But Wendi did not tell police that she believed Charlie had actually arranged the killing. She described the comment as a joke. She also denied involvement in Dan's murder. Wendi has never been charged in the killing. Her father, Harvey Adelson, has also not been charged. Those distinctions matter. The later convictions established criminal responsibility for several members of the conspiracy, but they did not establish that every person connected to the family was involved. Investigators also interviewed Jeffrey Lacasse, a professor who had been dating Wendi. Lacasse had his own perspective on the family conflict. He told police that Charlie and the rest of the Adelson family intensely disliked Dan. But investigators had to separate perception from evidence. A person saying that a family hated someone is not proof of murder. And in those first days, police had very little physical evidence connecting anyone to the shooting. Then they found the Prius. Surveillance footage from the gym showed the vehicle following Markel. Additional surveillance and traffic footage helped investigators trace the car. There were city cameras. There was a bus camera. There were toll records. Piece by piece, detectives began reconstructing the Prius's movements. The investigation was no longer simply about who might have wanted Markel dead. It was becoming a question of who had physically traveled to Tallahassee to make it happen. The Prius had been rented in South Florida. Investigators eventually connected the rental to two men, Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia. Cell phone records and surveillance helped establish that the men had traveled from South Florida toward Tallahassee shortly before the murder. The investigation was beginning to expose a chain, but there was still a missing link. Who had hired them? Rivera would eventually provide the answer investigators had been looking for. He admitted involvement and told investigators that Garcia had been recruited to kill Markel. Rivera said he became involved through Garcia, and he described a payment of approximately $100,000 connected to the murder. He also identified Katherine Magbanua as the intermediary. Magbanua was significant because she was connected to both sides of the alleged conspiracy. She had been romantically involved with Garcia, and she had also been in a relationship with Charlie Adelson. That connection gave investigators a potential bridge between the men who traveled to Tallahassee and the Adelson family. Then another detail surfaced. After Markel's murder, Katherine Magbanua began receiving money from the Adelson family's dental practice. Investigators found that she was being paid even though they found no evidence that she actually worked there. Standing alone, payments from a dental practice do not prove participation in murder. But investigators were not looking at one isolated fact. They were reconstructing an alleged conspiracy through a collection of relationships, communications, travel records, surveillance, and financial evidence. Rivera's confession became one of the major turning points. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2016 and ultimately received a 19-year sentence. His cooperation helped investigators move further up the chain. But the legal process would become complicated because the person investigators believed stood between the Adelson family and the shooters was Katherine Magbanua. And Magbanua was not going to simply accept the accusation. Magbanua was arrested in October 2016. The case against her took years to reach a final verdict. Her first trial ended without a conviction. Then came delays, legal battles, and disputes over evidence. In 2022, the retrial finally began. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Magbanua was the link. She had relationships with both Charlie Adelson and Sigfredo Garcia. She had access to information about Markel, and prosecutors argued that she helped arrange the killing. The defense disputed the state's interpretation of the evidence, but after approximately 8 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its decision. On May 27, 2022, Magbanua was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, followed by additional consecutive terms. The person investigators believed had helped connect the alleged mastermind to the shooters was now convicted, but the case still had one major question: who exactly had ordered the killing? The investigation had already pointed toward Charlie Adelson, but prosecutors needed more than family conflict and a strange joke. They needed evidence connecting Charlie to the murder. And that evidence eventually included recordings. In 2016, the FBI recorded Charlie and Magbanua during an undercover operation, sometimes referred to as the bump. The conversations were important because investigators believed Charlie was speaking cautiously about the murder. In one later described conversation, Donna Adelson used the word TV while speaking with Charlie about money. The significance came from the earlier hitman joke. Prosecutors argued that TV was being used as coded language. Charlie responded in a way that suggested he understood the reference. The defense challenged the state's interpretation of these conversations. That became a recurring theme in the case. Was the language evidence of a conspiracy? Or could seemingly suspicious conversations be interpreted another way? The jury would eventually have to decide. Charlie Adelson was arrested in April 2022 and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation. His trial began in October 2023. By then, prosecutors had already secured convictions against Rivera, Garcia, and Magbanua. But Charlie was different. He was not accused of pulling the trigger. The state's case depended on the theory that he helped arrange the killing. And Charlie had his own explanation. He testified that the hitman comment had been a stupid joke. He acknowledged making it more than once. He even acknowledged making it to Magbanua, but he denied ever seriously looking into hiring a hitman. He also claimed that after learning of Markel's murder, he became the target of an extortion scheme. According to his defense, he was not the person who ordered the killing. He was someone who had been threatened by people who had already committed it. That distinction was central to his defense. The prosecution presented a very different picture. It argued that the evidence was not one isolated coincidence. It was a network. The relationships, the money, the communication, the surveillance, the hired killers, the intermediary, and the alleged motive involving Wendi's relocation. The jury rejected Charlie's explanation. On November 6, 2023, Charlie Adelson was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus consecutive terms for conspiracy and solicitation. There was now another extraordinary development. The convictions had moved from the men who carried out the killing to the people accused of arranging it. But investigators were not finished. Donna Adelson, Wendi and Charlie's mother, had long been a central figure in the family's conflict with Markel. She had also been mentioned in evidence concerning the relocation dispute, and prosecutors ultimately alleged that Donna was more than an angry mother defending her daughter. They alleged she became part of the murder conspiracy. In November 2023, Donna was arrested by the FBI while attempting to leave the United States. She was arrested in South Florida while preparing to travel abroad. Prosecutors alleged that she was attempting to flee to Vietnam. She was later returned to Tallahassee and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation. For the first time, The prosecution would have to present its case against the woman it portrayed as the family matriarch behind the plot. Donna's trial would not happen immediately. Her first scheduled trial was interrupted in September 2024 when her defense attorney withdrew because of a conflict of interest issue. A new defense team was eventually assembled. The trial was rescheduled for 2025. By then, the case had already become one of the most closely followed murder prosecutions in Florida, and the prosecution's theory had evolved from what police knew in 2014. Investigators were no longer trying to identify an unknown killer. They had a complete alleged chain: Rivera, Garcia, Magbanua, Charlie Adelson, and now Donna Adelson. The state argued that the chain ultimately led back to the family's desire to eliminate the custody obstacle standing between Wendi and a move to South Florida. The defense challenged that conclusion. Donna's attorneys argued that the state was taking evidence about other people's conduct and using it to place Donna inside the conspiracy without sufficient direct proof. Their argument was essentially this: a motive is not a murder. A family conflict is not a conspiracy, and suspicion is not evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. The 2025 trial became a test of whether the accumulated evidence was enough. Jurors heard about the divorce. They heard about the relocation dispute. They heard about communications among the Adelsons. They heard testimony about the people already convicted. And they heard evidence about phone records. One important piece of the state's presentation involved the movements of the Adelsons around the time of the murder. Phone records showed Donna and Harvey traveling toward the area of Charlie's home. Donna also sent Charlie a message that read, "Outside your house." The prosecution used these records to establish the relationships and movements surrounding the alleged conspiracy. The defense disputed what those records proved. A phone being in a location does not automatically establish what its owner was doing. A message does not automatically reveal its full meaning. That is why the trial was ultimately about the entire evidentiary picture rather than one dramatic piece of evidence. One of the most closely examined pieces of evidence involved the language used after investigators began secretly recording Charlie. Prosecutors argued that Charlie's conversations became more careful after what investigators called the bump. The state presented recordings in which Charlie and Donna discussed money using language prosecutors said was coded. The word TV became particularly important. Years earlier, Charlie's supposed joke about a television had been introduced to police by Wendi. Now prosecutors were arguing that the same word appeared in later conversations with a different meaning. The prosecution's interpretation was that Donna and Charlie understood what the coded language meant because they were discussing the aftermath of a murder-for-hire arrangement. The defense rejected that interpretation. And that distinction is important. The recordings did not contain a simple sentence saying, "We hired someone to kill Dan Markel." Instead, prosecutors asked jurors to interpret conversations in the context of everything else they had heard. Another important witness was Katherine Magbanua. She had already been convicted. That meant the jury knew she had her own criminal history and her own reason to protect herself. Her testimony therefore had to be evaluated carefully. But prosecutors used her account to connect Charlie and Donna to the people who carried out the murder. The defense challenged her credibility and emphasized the difference between what she personally knew and what prosecutors wanted the jury to infer from her testimony. This was one of the central difficulties of the case. Much of the alleged conspiracy existed through intermediaries. The people accused of arranging the killing were separated from the actual shooting by other people. That meant the prosecution had to show not merely that these individuals knew one another, but that their relationships formed a criminal agreement. The jury ultimately accepted the state's theory. Then came the question of Wendi. Her name had been present in the case from the beginning. She was Dan's former wife. She had wanted to relocate. She had told police about Charlie's hitman joke immediately after the murder. And the prosecution's alleged motive centered on the custody conflict involving her children. Yet Wendi has not been charged with Dan Markel's murder. That distinction has remained important throughout the case. The convictions of other family members do not automatically establish Wendi's guilt. Nor do they establish that she knew about the murder beforehand. There have been public theories about her role for years. But theories are not the same as criminal charges, and the evidence presented at the various trials has not resulted in a prosecution against her. The same caution applies to Harvey Adelson, who has also not been charged. The legal record, therefore, tells a narrower story than some public speculation suggests. Several people have been convicted, others have not. And the unanswered questions around the people who were never charged remain unanswered. On September 4, 2025, after weeks of testimony, Donna Adelson's jury returned its verdict: guilty, first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit murder. The jury had deliberated for just over 3 hours. Donna became the 5th person convicted in connection with Dan Markel's murder. The prosecution's theory had now survived 5 separate criminal prosecutions, but the case was not legally over. Donna's attorneys sought a new trial. They argued, among other things, that the evidence was insufficient and raised concerns about juror conduct. In September 2025, Judge Stephen Everett rejected the request, finding sufficient credible evidence to support the verdict. Donna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, followed by a consecutive 30-year term for conspiracy. She has maintained her innocence and intends to appeal. And there was another significant legal development in 2026. Charlie Adelson's direct appeal reached Florida's 1st District Court of Appeal. His attorneys argued that several decisions made during his trial had deprived him of a fair trial. Among the issues were the denial of a change of venue, the handling of prospective jurors, the exclusion of certain evidence, and the admission or exclusion of recorded statements. The appellate court rejected those arguments. On July 1, 2026, the court affirmed Charlie Adelson's convictions and sentences. That means his convictions remain intact unless further appellate review changes the result. The court's opinion also summarized the prosecution's evidence in unusually useful detail. It described how surveillance showed Markel being followed before the murder, how investigators connected the rental vehicle to Rivera and Garcia, how Magbanua connected those men to the Adelsons, and how Rivera's confession helped investigators build the conspiracy case. The opinion also confirmed that Donna's direct appeal remained pending. So even 12 years after Dan Markel was killed, the legal process surrounding his murder continues. But perhaps the most striking part of the case is how long it took for the complete picture to emerge. On the morning of July 18, 2014, investigators knew that Dan Markel had been shot in his own garage. They knew a vehicle might have been involved. They knew the killing appeared deliberate. They knew there was a bitter custody dispute. But they did not yet know who had arranged the murder. They did not know the significance of the Prius. They did not know where the money came from. They did not yet have Rivera's confession. They did not have the later recordings. And they did not yet know how many people would eventually be convicted. The case was built gradually. A surveillance camera connected a vehicle to Markel. Records connected the vehicle to men from South Florida. Those men were connected to Magbanua. Magbanua was connected to Charlie. Financial evidence and communications added another layer. And eventually, prosecutors convinced separate juries that the chain reached further into the Adelson family. That is what makes the Dan Markel case so unusual. The murder itself took minutes. The investigation took years. The prosecution of the alleged conspiracy took more than a decade. There is also an uncomfortable irony in the case. Dan Markel spent years fighting in court over where his children would live. The dispute was being handled through lawyers, judges, motions, hearings, and arguments. The legal system was the arena in which the disagreement was supposed to be resolved. And yet prosecutors ultimately argued that people around him decided the legal system was taking too long. Instead of accepting the court's decision, the state alleged that they chose a completely different solution. They did not simply move the children. They did not win the relocation dispute. They allegedly removed the person standing in the way. That was the prosecution's theory of motive. It was accepted by multiple juries in the convictions that followed. But the precise private conversations and motivations of everyone who was not charged remain outside the established criminal verdicts. That is where the story should end, not with speculation, but with the boundaries of what has actually been proven. Dan Markel's family has spent years living with the consequences. His parents, Ruth Markel and Phil Markel, lost their son. His children lost their father. And the custody dispute that once existed between two parents became something far more permanent. Several people are now serving lengthy prison sentences. Luis Rivera received 19 years after pleading guilty and cooperating. Sigfredo Garcia is serving life. Katherine Magbanua is serving life. Charlie Adelson is serving life. Donna Adelson is serving life. And Charlie's conviction has now been affirmed on direct appeal. Donna's appeal remains pending. Those are the legal outcomes. But there is no verdict that can reconstruct the life Dan Markel should have had. There is no sentence that restores the years his children lost. And there is no courtroom finding that can answer every question people may still have about what happened behind closed doors before July 18, 2014. The case remains a reminder that the most complicated murders are not always the ones without suspects. Sometimes the mystery is how far the truth travels before anyone is willing to say where the trail ends. This is the final clue. If you want more carefully researched true crime documentaries that separate established facts from allegations and unanswered questions, subscribe to the channel.